When Yaakov Avinu had to run away from home in Eretz Yisrael and go to that spiritually desolate place, Haran, it was a terrible spiritual descent for him. But the result was amazing upliftment of himself, of the family that he built, and of the world at large. And that is symbolic of the neshama that also has to leave this incredibly spiritual environment in heaven and enter this world. The question is that for its own upliftment, or is there some deeper message that Hashem expects from us? Let's unpack Yaakov Avinu's story and the lessons that it carries for us. So if the Psukim, commenting on the Psukim where Yaakov Avinu is on his way out of Eretz Yisrael, and he says, Vayeitzei Yaakov neder leimor, Yaakov Avinu makes an oath, Im yeh Elokim imodi gomer, if the Eibishter will be with me, v'hoya havai li le'Elokim, then the Eibishter will be my God, v'evan azois asher santi matzeva yeh beis Elokim gomer, and this stone that I've made as a monument now will become a home for Hashem in the long term. So Fregim Meforshim, various commentaries ask this question. Vi kumtes, how does it work? As Yaakov Avinu, who's such a great individual, made his pledge to do the right thing, to do good things. The fact that he was going to make a place dedicated to Hashem. The fact that he'd give a portion of his proceeds to tzedakah. All of that is contingent on Hashem doing something first for him. Is that how it works? Did Yaakov Avinu only serve the Eibishter because he wanted something back in return? To receive a reward, which Pirkei Avos teaches us should never be the motivation for serving Hashem. And the fact that it's such a glaring question implies is derfun gufa gedrungen as mit seinem verbinden der neder meisim tovim. The fact that Yaakov Avinu linked his pledge to do good things mit hatnai, with a particular condition, hat Yaakov nicht gemeint, dass ein Matora is zu haben die Nyone hatnai. That should be clear to us then. Yaakov's goal is not that he needs the things that he's asking from Hashem. And in order to ensure that he would receive those things, he figured, let me invest and make a pledge of good deeds. Now, if anything, it was the exact opposite, and that's really important for us to remember. The Mator as ein is given the Kiyum HaNeder. Yaakov Avinu's primary goal was to be able to fulfill the things that he was now about to promise to do. The fact that he attached that to a condition, if the Eibishter will be with me and protect me, etc., is because he needed those steps to be there in order to be able to fulfill his promise. So it's not that he's saying, if you do for me, I'll do for you. He's saying, I want to do for you. The only thing is that in order to do it, I'm going to need a certain assistance. Let's understand that better. In order to understand it better, we're first going to explore the difference between two classical commentators and how they split up exactly what Yaakov Avinu said. There are two commentaries we're going to focus on about both the pledge and the conditions. Rashi learned, in Rashi's view, as the Tnai is Kelel, part of the condition includes, and endigt sich mit, in fact it concludes with, V'hoya Hashem li le'Elokim. If Hashem will be a God for me, then I'll do these things. What does it mean Hashem will be a God for me? Shelo yimatzeh psul bezari. That in my family, in my children, descendants, nobody will be disqualified. And Yaakov had good reason to worry because, of course, he had a brother Esav and an uncle Yishmael. So he wants to know that his children are all going to be Hashem's followers. And then, according to Rashi, in the Neder Hebtzachon mit dem zweiten Pasuk, the part where he makes his pledge starts in the next Pasuk where he says, that this stone which I've made as a monument will become a home for Hashem. Und der Ramban learned, whereas the Ramban says, as Hashem li le'Elokim, the fact that he says Hashem will be a God for me is nit the hemshach hatnai k'divrei Rashi, is not part of the condition, according to the Ramban. No, the onay von neder, that is part of his pledge. I will make Hashem my God. On that Tnai, and therefore, according to the Ramban, the last words of the condition are, the last thing that Yaakov requests is that I should come home to my father's house in peace. So, let's analyze the Ramban's approach, because there are things about it that we have to understand. Most obviously, if in the Ramban's view, the beginning of Yaakov's pledge is, I will make Hashem my God, so then the way the psukim were divided should have illustrated that point. It should have been in such a way as the part where Yaakov says Hashem will be my God, so should not have been as it currently is, the end of the pasuk that says, and bring me home in peace to my father, which is still part of the condition that Yaakov proposed. Not the aschala from pasuk neder. The part that says Hashem's going to be my God should have been the beginning of the next pasuk that leads into him pledging to build a house for Hashem on the spot, which is his promise. So how does the Ramban explain why the psukim are split in the way that they are? Especially when you consider that this idea of accepting Hashem as his God, according to the Ramban's approach, is not only linked to the idea of making a home for Hashem, because they both belong to a promise. Now, it's a much deeper connection. They both convey the same message. To borrow the language of the Ramban, I will serve the unique Hashem in this place that I will dedicate as some kind of a shrine, some kind of a temple. So if the content is so aligned, they should definitely be in the same pasuk. So therefore, we have to say that even from the Ramban's perspective, as the fact that Hashem will be my God, is part, in the Ramban's view, of the promise, still, it still has some way in which it is actually more aligned with the content of Yaakov Avinu coming home safely, even more than the content of creating a home for Hashem. Which would be the obvious reason why the two of them belong in a pasuk. So what we're suggesting is that the Ramban, unlike Rashi, says that Hashem will be my God is part of Yaakov's promise, and yet there's something about its message that is very closely aligned to the concept of coming back home in peace, and not as closely aligned with the pledge of making a home for Hashem. We need to unpack and understand what that is. Now, we've identified, at least according to the Ramban, that Yaakov Avinu's promise is split over two psukim. Is in one pasuk, and is in the next pasuk. Which implies, as we've started to explain, that there are obviously two different components to Yaakov's pledge. One component that is very closely associated with the V'shavti b'shalom, and another component that seems to be independent. So we can apply a similar logic to the conditions that Yaakov put forward, as they're also divided into two psukim. Out of one pasuk says, if Hashem will be with me, or shmorani gomer, and he will protect me, he'll give me food to eat and he'll give me clothing to wear. That's one part of the condition that Yaakov expects or hopes for. On base, and in a separate pasuk thing that Yaakov Avinu puts as his condition is v'shavti b'shalom el beis avi, that I will come home in peace. And like Rashi, and of course, Rashi believes that Hashem will be my God is part of the Tanai, if you will be my God and ensure that my future generations are as committed as I am. So if they're split into two psukim, must also mean that there are two components to the Tanoim, to the conditions that he made. So there is a promise he makes, which has two components, and there are conditions he asks for, which also have two components, and we need to understand what they are. You can actually see this illustrated in the wording of the pasuk. The first pasuk, Yaakov Avinu is speaking about the things that Hashem would do for him. You, Hashem, will be with me. Ushmorani, you will protect me, Gomer. Ve'nosani, Gomer, and you will give me food and clothing. Mashenkin in zweiten Pasuk, whereas the second Pasuk doesn't highlight the Eibishter doing for him as much as the result of what would be done. The second Pasuk in zweiten Pasuk is Elosim v'shavti gomer. I will return home. Nit v'heshi vani gomer v'chayetz b'zeh. Not you, Eibishter, will bring me back home. Which almost makes it sound like Yaakov's return home would be independent of Hashem. So that's a significant difference. We need to understand that difference. In order to understand it, we're going to explore this principle that Yaakov Avinu going to Haran was a tremendous descent, but it was for the purpose of a tremendous value that would emerge from it. So what explains everything that's happening over here is the Yerida von Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov Avinu's physical descent, which is of course also a spiritual descent, leaving the holiness of not only Eretz Yisrael but specifically Beersheba, a very tranquil environment, to go to a place outside of the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, or Befrat Charan, and out of all the possible destinations outside of Eretz Yisrael, where does he go? Charan, Charei Nafsha Mokim Ba'olam, which Rashi describes as the place that ignites Hashem's anger in the world. That's a terrible yerida, descent for Yaakov Avinu, is given a tzarech aliyah. The intention behind it is that Yaakov should catapult much higher. On the aliyah, or in the aliyah, zayin do drei inyonim, and there are three components to this aliyah, and that's what we're really going to be focusing on. First of all, Aleph, durch der was eindig dort, the fact that Yaakov could have been there in Charan, which is a bad place, Beis Lavan, specifically in Lavan's home, which is a very dishonest environment, and is a nit mushba gevoren von sei. Yaakov Avinu was not in any way influenced by that bad environment. Und is aros von dort shalom el achet, and was able to leave there free of sin, complete without sin. So having had that challenge and stood his ground, is Yaakov nisali gevoren saheche dargavi is given freer koidem hayirida. Then for sure Yaakov Avinu is now at a higher level than he was before he ever left Eretz Yisrael and had such challenges. And that's similar to it's similar to the advantage that a Baal Tshuva has over a tzaddik, because as the Gemara tells us, that the level at which a Baal Tshuva stands is a level that the tzaddik, even a complete tzaddik, never gets to stand at. Why? It's because the Baal Tshuva had been exposed to and had sampled what Averis feel like. And in spite of that temptation and having that flavor, he's pulled back and overwhelmed his Yetzer Hara and not followed in that path. That is a greater achievement than a person who's been protected from that challenge. So Yaakov Avinu in Beersheba and Eretz Yisrael is immune to the challenge. Yaakov Avinu in Haran has stood up to the challenge. That's a much higher level. So the first aliyah is for Yaakov himself. Second aliyah is do dafka durchifitim tzivoi. It's specifically in the toxic environment of Haran that he fulfills the great mitzvah of having children and taking over the world. That is why he was instructed by his parents to go there to find a wife, and he was blessed that he would be fruitful. Specifically, Yaakov Avinu's success in building a family is that all of his children were connected to Hashem, unlike the experience of his father and grandfather. So the second aliyah for Yaakov is he comes out with a family, which is one of the greatest things that a person can do. And lastly, the third area of aliyah is b'lashon Chassidus, in the language of Chassidus, durch zan avoda mit Yitzoin Lavan, because Yaakov Avinu was involved as a shepherd looking after Lavan's sheep. And he did that for 20 years. Yaakov succeeded in elevating all the lost sparks of holiness that were embedded within Lavan's flocks. And that had such a profound elevation for Yaakov to the extent that he became hugely successful. And that's not only materially, it means that he had this massive, expansive success, both materially and spiritually. So Yaakov's Yerida and the 3 degrees of his Aliyah that follow as a result of it is a template for how things are in our experience, because Maaseh Oves Simul Abonim, all the stories of our ancestors, are indications and are an empowerment for our own journeys. So his move on, for that reason we can understand as the inyan from Vayeitzei Yaakov mi Beersheva vayelech Harana. This concept of Yaakov leaving Beersheva and going to a horrible place called Haran is something that would play out in our service of Hashem on a personal level. And wie der Achaim is mevor. The Achaim explains that the pasuk is merames of klolos yirides haneshama lemata. The Achaim says Vayeitzei Yaakov miber shalom b'shava vayelech harana is metaphoric of the neshama leaving Gan Eden in order to enter this world. On Oich of Tirida von Eden in Galus, plus it's also indicative of the entire concept of Jews as a nation being out of Eretz Yisrael in Galus. But this is also a Yerida Tzorech Aliyah. It's also designed that it's not for the purpose of descent or for the purpose of deflation, but it's for the purpose of rebound and the purpose of growth beyond, exponential growth. Und in dem sind dort Dinyonim anal, that in der Aliyah von Yaakov, if there are 3 degrees of elevation that Yaakov experienced, of exponential growth, then we can expect that there are 3 areas of potential exponential growth in our own world, as a neshama living in this body and a Jew living in Golus. But let's look at the neshama and the body specifically. The first thing that we have to note is the neshama zayndik l'mayla farda yerida izi b'v'chinas tzadik. Before the neshama entered this world, when it was still floating around in Gan Eden, it was the equivalent of a tzaddik, completely immune to anything negative, like Yaakov Avinu in Beersheba. Und dem was is yerd l'mata in vet nislabish na guf nefesh abamis. But by virtue of the fact that the neshama descends into this world and gets wrapped up inside a human body with the distractions of a nefesh abamis, both of which blur the vision of godliness. And yet the neshama succeeds in maintaining Torah and mitzvahs in this world. The neshama now has an elevation from as the pasuk says that the spirit returns to the Eibishter from Baal Tshuva, becomes like a Baal Tshuva. So just like Yaakov Avinu, who now had the challenge of Haran, is far superior in his spirituality than when he was protected in Eretz Yisrael, the neshama, standing up to the challenges of the Guf and Nefesh Abamis, has advantage over what it was like in Gan Eden. That's number 1. Number 2, Beis, literally, being in this world, just like Yaakov Avinu could now fulfill the mitzvah, the key mitzvah of having children, so a neshama can only fulfill that mitzvah while in this world. And Torah mitzvahs bichlal, and the truth is that applies to all Torah and mitzvahs. So that's an advantage. And the third is Gimel Gashmim, by virtue of the fact that the neshama lives in this world, engages with this world, and uses the elements of this world to serve Hashem. As the Welt of that helps to transform this world to become Hashem's home, as we call it, a dwelling place for Hashem in the lowest realm. And that catapults the neshama way higher than it was in Gan Eden, and as we're going to discover, even higher than it is elevated through its own avodah within its own personal journey. The concept of transforming our materialistic world to become Hashem's home, and then of course by extension the impact that has on elevating the neshama, is so part of how we engage with this world is not only doing Torah and mitzvahs, but it's doing things that are ordinary, neutral things with a spiritual intention, with a holy intention, which is all your actions should be directed towards Hashem, and to acknowledge and know Hashem in everything that you do. If the avodah for Torah and mitzvahs has a certain value that is even greater than what we achieve through Torah and mitzvahs. Because by virtue of the fact that a person takes things that are actually in their domain, that they could have used for themselves, money a person could have used for themselves, food they could have just enjoyed for themselves, ma'asecha, as the expression goes, Yodit, und Rochecha, as the pasuk says, your ways. And now they become Zayin Hashem Shemayim in an open fundoeu, they're directed towards heaven, and they create awareness of Hashem. That creates Hashem's home in the real lowly world, not the world that is reserved already for holiness through Torah and mitzvahs, the part of the world that was never designated for holiness, and now we've brought holiness into that place. That's a real achievement. So now that we're starting to appreciate that there's an advantage to what we do to serve Hashem in the ordinary world, even over what we do to serve Hashem within the context of Torah and mitzvahs, so now that we know that that illustrates to us that when we have an impact on the world, it gives the neshama greater elevation than even just the fact that the neshama entered this world and became a Baal Tshuva because it was confronted with the challenges and distractions of this world and stood its ground. In other words, mitzvah. As long as a Jew is doing a mitzvah, even if in order to do the mitzvah, the person first has to fight with and overcome the Yetzer Hara, that tries to obstruct doing that mitzvah. So even if that's what it is, any time that a person does a mitzvah, von deswegen, as soon as a person does overwhelm the Yetzer Hara, and therefore goes ahead to do the mitzvah, is toshash yitzroi. The net outcome is that the Yetzer Hara in this context is neutralized or weakened, which allows the real motivation of the Jewish person to come to the fore. As the Rambam describes, every Jew really, deep down, wants to do all of the mitzvahs, so that can now come to the fore. So the result is, as in dem kiyama mitzvah gufot the Yetzer Hara kein shaychus nit. If you do an honest, objective assessment of a mitzvah, a Yetzer Hara has no place in context of a mitzvah. It doesn't belong to a Yetzer Hara. This is a Jew who's sidelined the Yetzer Hara so that their real intention can be revealed and can be applied. I really want to do a mitzvah. Yetzer Hara, get out of my way. You have nothing to do this. So technically then, doing a mitzvah is not real Baal Tshuva experience. It's still tzaddik experience because it's my neshama speaking its truth. I haven't really converted anything. But when a person is sitting in their office and their business day is conducted in a way directed towards heaven, and whatever a person does, eating, exercising, socializing, is all to be able to create awareness of Hashem. Why does a person want to eat? Why does a person want to eat? Because of the neshama? Why does a person want money? Because of the neshama? No. It's human nature. I want to eat. I need to survive. I need to have money to be able to support my family. And that's all guided mitzad nafsha habahamis. That's all motivated by the nefesh habahamis itself. Not like a mitzvah which is motivated by the nefesh halikis. Eating, socializing, exercising, making money is motivated by the nefesh habahamis. Which means that even when the person is so focused that whatever they're doing is directed towards heaven, and within whatever they're doing they're acknowledging Hashem, still they're still called your actions and your ways because they're the world of you, of the conscious you, of the independent you, of the egoist. So therefore, when a person succeeds in doing ordinary activities with a higher purpose, then not only is the person's generalized experience like a Baal Tshuva, there was a challenge, but I overcame the challenge. The person is a Baal Tshuva, I've changed myself. I've transformed my nefesh habahamis. So impacting the world through ordinary activities with a higher purpose is more of a transformative experience than overriding the Yetzer Hara so that the neshama can speak its natural truth and do a mitzvah. Let's explain this better. So in order to better explain the advantage of the teshuva or Baal Tshuva element of taking ordinary things and directing them towards heaven, as opposed to just the teshuva of overwhelming and overcoming the Yetzer Hara, which is also present when a person does a mitzvah. So to explain that better, let's analyze as follows. We well know that one of the great assets of tshuva is the force of tshuva. When a person does tshuva, it brings to the fore just how powerful and immutable that person's connection to Hashem is. When a person does tshuva, they illustrate quite clearly that their connection to Hashem was not ruined by the Aveira. That's why, despite the Aveira and whatever damage you'd expect the Aveira to do spiritually, I can still do tshuva. That shows you how strong my connection is. Even the Aveira could not break it. The same concept applies to tshuva when we're describing the neshama entering our physical world. As in dem sagt sich heraus beginnt der Teukef heiskashus von der Neshama mitten Eibishten. Being in this world is where you see the real depth and power of the neshama's connection to Hashem. That even when that neshama is wrapped up inside a human body and a nefesh habahamis and a Yetzer Hara even, is verbunden mit Nebischen durch Avodas Hashem, still connected to Hashem. How do I know? Because it's still doing what Hashem wants. So like Teshuvah, that shows me the strength and the power of the connection that even external circumstances and even damaging behaviors can't harm it. So if we're examining the power of the connection, then again we can appreciate why that is even more profound when a person is doing ordinary activities for Hashem than when they're doing Torah mitzvahs despite the distraction of a Yetzer Hara. Now we can understand the greatness of Teshuvah that is motivated by doing ordinary things towards Hashem, as compared to the Teshuvah meaning the neshama overcoming whatever particular challenge it might have, and doing what Hashem wants by doing the Torah mitzvahs. Why is that? Because in the avodah von Torah mitzvahs, through the service of Hashem, which requires studying Torah and doing mitzvahs, sagt sich heraus der Teukef heiskashus von der neshama in them, that expresses this amazingly powerful connection of the neshama to Hashem. Was euch seindig in Guf und Nefesh Habamis hat sie bekehrt zu stärken sich über sie. The power that the neshama, even when it has to contend with an animal soul and the limitations of a human body, still is able to overcome them and escape their compelling grip, toshash yitzroi, to weaken the Yetzer Hara. But when a person's not only doing Torah mitzvahs, but doing ordinary things for the sake of heaven, that means a whole different world. Not only can the neshama speak its truth despite the opposition, the neshama can speak its truth in an environment where the narrative is controlled typically by the nefesh habahamis. That shows an incredibly powerful connection between the neshama and Hashem. All right, so what do we have so far? A neshama entering this world is Yerida Tzorich Aliyah. There's going to be huge value every single time the neshama is able to speak its truth in spite of the opposition of a Yetzer Hara. Deeper and greater than that is when a person in their world is doing their things, which are normal things, but for Hashem's sake. That means that the Nefesh HaKis has taken over the voice of the Nefesh HaBahamis and is now controlling a space that typically the Nefesh HaBahamis would have controlled. But there's something even more profound than that. Even this greatness of the neshama, the greatness of doing something which is permissible but not mitzvah for Hashem's sake, that's nothing compared to how much the neshama will be completely rocketed heavenward when it touches the world, not just my world, the broader world. Makes a dira b'sachtoinim. Yaakov Avinu taking Lavan's sheep and converting that into some, not his sheep, Lavan's sheep, and converting that into something that is connected to Hashem. So let's explain how and why that is. One explanation goes like this. The skashus von der Neshama mit dem Eibishten is verbunden mit der Metzius und Teva. The fact that the Neshama is naturally connected to Hashem is exactly that. It's nature. It's part of the Neshama's nature. Und der Rebbe, Hagam as Teva is skashus mit HaToikef, and therefore even though the natural connection between the Neshama and Hashem is incredibly powerful, is so powerful that even when you wrap it up inside a body and a Nefesh HaBahamis, it remains strong. As long as this remains the natural reality of the neshama's being, is don de magbola, there has to be some limit to how powerful it could be, because it's natural. So as long as an neshama is working within what it can do, what is natural for it, it wants to do Torah mitzvahs, so it's doing amazing things within the context of what's natural for a neshama. But once the neshama starts to turn elements of the world out there into vehicles for godliness, that concept was that they should become vehicles for godliness. It's not natural for the neshama. It's natural for the neshama to have its connection to Hashem. It's not natural for the neshama to have the world connected to Hashem, and it's not natural for the world to be connected to Hashem. To the contrary, the reality by nature of the world, which is called world from the word helem, concealment, is a barrier to, an obstruction to godliness. So how's it possible to turn the world into a godly place? It's not possible. Now it's and it's only possible because of Hashem's koyach. Because the oneness of Hashem obviously has no limitations, therefore, then even the world with all its darkness can become a place of godliness. Why? Because Hashem is so great. Not because the world is great. So therefore, when the neshama succeeds in making the world or a piece of the world into Hashem's home, which really, what does that do? It brings into the open that Hashem's oneness has no restriction, no limits. It's everywhere, even in our world. That impacts the neshama, that now the neshama's connection to Hashem is no longer limited to its personal experience or natural experience. But it's now a factor of the neshama being tied in to Hashem's infinite oneness, which now expands the neshama into a place of infinity. So these 3 degrees of elevation of the neshama, its ability to do Torah mitzvahs even in the world, its ability to take normal activities of the person and connect them to Hashem, and then ultimately its ability to transform the world to become godly. So these aliyahs, which are only accessible once the neshama has descended into this world, even that is not yet the ultimate reason why the neshama entered this world. So what is the ultimate reason? In other words, the fact that the neshama will benefit, the fact that the neshama will be transported to a whole different level is great for the neshama. It's not necessarily the ultimate purpose. What is the ultimate purpose? The Mishnah Perkei Avos tells us everything that the Eibishter created for His honor. The Gemara tells us that I was only created to serve Hashem. It's verstandig, so you can just logically understand as the Tachlis HaMechuvim from Brias Adam and Yeridus HaNeshama Lamata, that the ultimate purpose of the creation of people and the fact that those people's neshamas entered this world is nitziliv dali from the neshama, can't be for just the neshama's benefit. Now, it has to be that the ultimate purpose is to do what the Eibishter wants, for His glory and greatness. And I was created to service that greatness. Now, the Alter Rebbe sagt in Tanya, you can see something similar described the Alter Rebbe in Tanya. The Alter Rebbe makes it very clear that the neshama's descent into this world is not intended for the neshama's benefit. The reason the neshama enters this world, Alter Rebbe makes it clear, is for the benefit of the body, the nefesh habahamis, and the world. Lekashram, to link them, or leyachdam, and to unite them, Vayeitzei Baruch with Eibishter's infinite light. That fulfills Eibishter's desire to have a home in this world. Okay, so yes, there's huge benefit to the neshama. That is not the purpose. The purpose is to do what the Eibishter wants. And therefore, it says, no, was the neshama is the kavana hanal. So it happens that the neshama is the catalyst to make all these things happen and to transform the world into a godly place. So therefore, the neshama naturally will receive an infinite degree of reward, which which means that the neshama will naturally be elevated infinitely. So if that's the case, let's ask ourselves this question. If we're saying that the ultimate purpose is not the aliyah of the neshama, but is fulfillment of Hashem's objective, so how do you explain what it says in many, many places? As the yiridas haneshama lamato is bishvil aliyah. We always say it, that the reason the neshama enters down into this world, descends into this world, is in order to elevate. Which implies that the fact that the neshama also gets an aliyah is not an also. Not the tam b'tachlis from Yerida. It's actually the purpose of why it descended into the world in the first place. So which one is it? Are we here in this world to elevate our neshamas? Or are we here in this world through the various avodas that we do? Or are we here in this world purely to satisfy Hashem's objectives? So at least the nakuda, the kernel of what this is all about, and it's based on a mimer, so you can imagine that there's a lot more detail. So you're doing them inyan von dirla. We well know that when we speak about the concept of the Eibishter having a home in the lowest reality, one of the explanations is as dafka tachtonim ve'nadir lo yisparich lo latzmosai, that it's only in the lowest realm that it is possible to have a place that is home to Hashem himself, to Hashem's essence. Why would that be? You'd expect that the heavens surely should be a great place to accommodate a divine abode, a home for Hashem. Why dafka in the lowest realm? Because in Elyonim zayin mer giluyim. Because the reality of heavens is it's a place of divine revelation, and divine revelation is graded. There are different kinds of divine revelation, and each one has its power and its limits on power. In our lowly world, there is no revelation. There's nothing being shared, and therefore we don't get distracted by the greatness, the fanciness, the power, the inspiration, and we connect directly to Hashem's essence. On their inyan, so that concept, which is actually a radical concept in Chassidus, that access to Hashem's essence happens only here in the lowest realms, because Hashem's essence is most found, accessible in the lowest realms, is verbunden mit was darf generell is that the bittul von ein oid. It's because only in this world is it possible to reach the state of complete surrender and submission, to recognize there is nothing but God. Which is totally different to the spiritual realms. In the spiritual realms, the assessment of everything is it's as if it doesn't exist. Everything that is close to Hashem, is considered like nothing. In this world, it's possible to reach the point of not just we're like nothing, to reach the point there is nothing other than God. On a yois as the kavone is as the dir soll sich uftan durch avodas ha'adam dafka. Considering that Hashem didn't want the home he was going to have in the lowest realms to be his creation, but rather to be our achievement through our avodah. So then the methodology that we use to create this home has to reflect what the home is going to look like, and therefore it requires us to be in a state of complete surrender to Hashem. To reach ideally the kind of surrender to Hashem, which is the kind of surrender that says almost as if we could experience there is nothing else besides Hashem. Like the bittul of a simple servant. He's not like a more senior servant, who's got a higher rank in the household, who appreciates the greatness of the master and is therefore passionate to dedicate himself to the master. This is a simple servant who understands pretty much nothing. He just knows there is a master, and that's all that counts. There's a master. There's nothing else to consider. There's a master, you serve him, and finished. And that's the goal of where we want to get to. There's an Eibishter, there's nothing else, and that's who we serve. Based on that, we can make a very important distinction. As those was steht is the fact that there are many sources in Torah that indicate as that the goal and purpose of a neshama entering this lowly world is for the neshama to be elevated. That is verbunden damit, was steht in Tanya, as Yiridas HaNeshama Lamata is bichdei to durchführen the Kavana v'dir b'tachtonim. That's if we're talking in the context of what the Alter Rebbe says, that the only reason a neshama enters this world is to be able to create a home for Hashem in this world. Warum die Aliyas HaNeshama ist doch, was sie kommt zu beginnes bittel. Because what's the goal? Bring a neshama into this world, and it can attain this principle of bittel. As er avoid es nicht mit Sadir Metzius, where the neshama won't just do what is natural for it, natural to have a connection to Hashem through doing mitzvahs. But the goal is that it should be doing what Hashem wants to illustrate Hashem's oneness. Not because it's natural for me as a neshama to be magnetized towards Hashem, but rather because there's an avodah to illustrate that there is nothing else but Hashem, and therefore I must do what the Eibishter wants. Und in der Kavana von dir betachtenim ist doch negea, as die Avedas HaNeshama was tut auf die Dira soll sein wie Vechinas Bittul, and therefore when we're talking about that, we're saying that the goal of the Neshama entering this world is not just that it should gain Aliyah, but rather that it should achieve Bittul, complete submission and surrender to whatever Hashem wants. That's actually the objective. So, Pikolanal, wenn verstandig werden, die vielen Yonemanal, was in Hemshach Aksum von Vayeitzei Yaakov Neder. Now that we understand that there are two seriously different, or subtly different, but serious components of what it means to serve Hashem, that the neshama comes down into this world and it benefits. But the ultimate is actually not the benefit of the neshama, but rather the expression of Ein Oid, the Eibishter's goal, which is that our world, which is not distracted by the great lights of spiritual revelations, should become the place which is the ultimate home of Hashem. With this information, we can go back to Yaakov and the four components of the two elements of his promise and the two elements of the Tanoim that he expected. We can understand the two components of the conditions he made, which is Aleph, that Eibishter should protect me and be with me on the one hand, and on the other hand, and provide for me. Then a second concept of the Tanai, or on base, independently, that I'll return in peace to my father's home. Was von sehr Verandertelling in zwei Psukim is moving as in zwei Sugim Kanal, as we mentioned before. The fact that those two are brought in two separate Psukim indicates that they're two separate messages. On side, it's Vayeitzei from the Neder, the Pirush Ramban, and we can also analyze the two components of Yaakov's pledge. The Ramban telling us that there are two separate components. Aleph, the one being V'hoya Havaya Lilelekim, that I'll take the Eibishter as my God, commitment. On base, and separately, I'll turn a piece of this world into Hashem's home. Which we can also distinguish as two separate things because they're in two separate psukim. The Tachlis HaMechuven is Komenil Sif Aleph the Neder. We already said right from the beginning that we shouldn't mistakenly believe that Yaakov was most interested in the conditions being fulfilled and was trying to buy his way to get those brachos by making a promise to do certain things. It's the opposite. He wanted the opportunity to commit to Hashem through those promises, and therefore davened that he should be able to be facilitated with these conditions. So with that in mind, and that Tanai is not a veg that the conditions are only the way to achieve the fulfillment of his pledge. And when you add to that our analysis of the fact that the neshama descending into this world is for two different reasons. Aleph b'shvil aliyas haneshama, one reason being so that the neshama should be elevated way beyond what it was before, and base primarily b'chdei tzufton dir b'sachtonim, to be able to turn this world into Hashem's home. And I say, in ihr avoida was bringt zu dem seinen dort zwei Inyanim, which therefore implies that there are also two modes of avoida that the neshama has to do. The avoida von Torah and mitzvahs. The primary part that elevates the neshama is Torah and mitzvahs, and the avodah from Komasech L'Shem Shamayim, and the part that starts to impact the world, which is ordinary activities being directed heavenward. So with all that information, darf kommen The result has to be, as die zwei Nyonim von dem Tnai seine die zwei Suge Avoida Hanal, that the two parts of Yaakov Avinu's sets of conditions speak to these two types of Avoida. Let's see how, and you'll actually see it quite easily in the words. The first part of the condition is that the Eibusha should protect him and provide for him. That is a request for Hashem's help to stay away from that which is negative and unhealthy, to avoid Averas. That's under the blanket of Ushmorani, that the Eibusha should protect me from what? From Averas. And in that same pasuk, he's also asking for help to be able to do Torah mitzvahs in the positive. Limud Torah mitzvahs, which is lechem ubeged, as we know in Tanya, that Torah is compared to food and mitzvahs are compared to garments. So that's the first request that he has. Assist me in the avodah of Torah and mitzvahs, because as we've identified, that is the first arena in which the neshama has to do its avodah in this world. Get past the distractions of the Yetzer Hara and do Torah mitzvahs anyway. So Hashem, please help me with that. That's Yaakov's first request. Then he asks, please allow me to come home to my father's home in peace. That's the avodah in Divrei Harashus. That describes how he's going to engage the parts of the world that are not automatically Torah mitzvahs. Which, as we've described, is much more similar to tshuva. What's tshuva? Well, you transform that which was negative to become positive. You transform the materialism of this world to become catalysts for godliness. Therefore, the word is v'shafti, to return. Even though what drives a person to eat, to run a business, to exercise, to socialize, etc. That's what my nefesh habahamis wants. Yet, this is a person who is able to avoid being dragged down into something negative through those behaviors, and therefore he is what shalom, to come back in peace, shalom in achet. That he should be immune to Aveira, that he wouldn't learn, this was part of his prayer, he shouldn't be affected by Lavan's behavior. Saying what protects the person from not being schlepped into the toxic behaviors that are associated with personal pleasures or personal needs. Why? Because he was never interested in himself. No l'shem shamayim. It was all directed towards heaven. So the two tnoim that Yaakov describes effectively capture the two types of avoida, Torah mitzvahs, and kol masecha l'shem shamayim. On die zwei suge avoida, because he's got this dual approach in how he's going to serve Hashem, bringen zu die zwei Nyonim von neder, they bring about the fulfillment of the two parts of what he describes as his pledge. Die kavana tachlis von Yudis and Neshama matter, which is supposed to describe, remember, the pledge is where we want to get to. I want to be able to do these things. So I want to be able to fulfill the purpose of why my neshama came into this world. So what are the two steps? First of all, the Eibusha should become my personal God. It should be real to me. That describes the aliyah aforementioned, the neshama. The fact that the neshama should now be elevated for having engaged the savoida. And then the next step of the goal is that the physical stone should turn into Hashem's home, which is to make a home for Hashem in this world. Now we've already described earlier what is the ultimate elevation of the neshama, not just simply to reveal its nature in an environment that isn't inclined to its nature, but rather to get the neshama to go beyond its natural composure. Und sie ist das Hashem nicht mitzad der Teva, to serve Hashem not because it is natural to do so, no mitzad dem Eibishter, but because it's what the Eibishter wants. It's the recognition of the fact that the Eibishter is everywhere. Ein oid, there is nothing else. And therefore the Eibishter is in every part of the world, even in the physicality of this world, which are not naturally godly. The Rebbe is to say that's why the order of how this is presented in the pasuk fits exactly that story. As for the fact that the Eibishter should become my God, is part of the conversation about turning the stone into a home for Hashem. Let's go back to the language that the Ramban used, which we mentioned earlier. I will serve the unique one God in the place of this stone, which will be transformed for me into a house of God. In other words, as an avodah wird sich onheren, wie sie ist, nicht mit sein Teva. He's illustrating over here that his avodah wouldn't just be in the context of his natural neshama position, but rather, but rather be this revolution, a stone that becomes a house of God. The fact that a stone could become a home for God is it's not because of the nature of my neshama. It's because of the fact that the Eibishter is everywhere and everything is one with Hashem. Yet, in spite of the fact that the Ramban says V'hoya Hashem li le'elekim is already part of the neder, I'll take Hashem as my God, it's still included in the pasuk together with the V'shafti b'shalom, which is the message of the T'nai, the condition that Yaakov made. Not in the same pasuk that speaks about the stone being transformed. Why is that? We've already explained that yes, the benefit to the neshama is that the neshama will be elevated. But the goal and purpose of the neshama entering in this world is not for the sake of the neshama's aliyah. But the ultimate goal is to be able to fulfill Hashem's dream, so to speak, of having a home in this world. Therefore, the concept of saying that the Eibishter should be my God, even though that is a natural result of the fact of the person doing avodah that the neshama is elevated, that is shayach mer beprat echad, in a certain way is more aligned. It's more aligned in the sense that it's not yet the ultimate goal. Zum T'nai, avodah, v'shafti b'shalom. It still belongs in the world of what I'm doing. I'm not yet at the goal. Even when the neshama is being elevated, I'm still not yet at the ultimate goal. And that's not quite yet like the ultimate goal, which is that the stone itself becomes godly, the world itself becomes a dir b'tachtonim. And the truth is, we can even align this with Rashi. Shloimar. Even from Rashi's perspective, as that the concept where Yaakov says that Hashem should be my God is nit de neder, it's not part of his pledge, not de t'nai, but part of what he was requesting, is prat. It's still a detail, nit in avodas haneshama biridosa lemata. It's still a detail not of the avoida part of what the neshama has to do down here on earth, nor in the aliyah was vet durch the avoida. Even Rashi would acknowledge it is a detail of what's going to happen to the neshama, al derech vida pirush Ramban, similar to what the Ramban actually said. Why is that? The way Rashi explains it, which is that his request V'hoya Hashem li le'elekim means that the Eibishter's name should be with me and my family and never be lost. Then not only should Eibishter's name be part of my journey right now at the beginning where I'm here, but all the way down at the end, so to speak, of the journey. Even in his children and their children. The only way to get that lasting degree of connection to Hashem would require that the person is working in a way that's not restricted just to their nature. Because then the nature of things is that they don't extend to the next generation. So it has to be without agbolos. The concept that we're describing over here, the neshama doing what Hashem wants because it's what Hashem wants. And those was lefi pershashe geitin voyavai ligoyma reinen tonight. Or nitin neder. So then why does Rashi include this part that Hashem will be my God as part of the condition rather than the promise Yaakov Avinu is making? And not the way that the Ramban explained it. Is weil die Aliyah von der Neshama is nor achona zum tachlis hamechuvan. It's because Rashi says the fact that the Neshama will be elevated is still not the goal. And it's only a preparation for the goal, which is to transform the world, and in Yaakov's context, the stone into Hashem's home. So it doesn't belong in the part that's talking about the ultimate purpose. One last point, which is just to distinguish between the perspective of Rashi and the perspective of the Ramban, and therefore why Rashi sees as part of the request, and the Ramban sees it as part of the promise, In Pirush Ramban, it's because the Ramban, although the Ramban explains the simplest understanding of the Psukim, he doesn't limit himself to that. In his introduction, he says that he also brings, so to speak, beautiful insights that appeal to people who appreciate deeper concepts. People who appreciate deeper concepts, that is similar to living in heaven and having spiritual revelation. It's very exciting and it's very meaningful, but it's also a little, in a sense, self-interested. And if you're living in that world where you're also looking for personal elevation, then if your neshama is elevated, that's actually part of the journey, part of the purpose of the journey. Yet Rashi, who ostensibly only looks at the simple understanding of the pasuk, but that's actually where you get the most profundity. Remember, it's in the lowest world that you get Hashem's essence. So Rashi, who looks at the simple understanding of the pasuk, was in Avodah Sodom, says the Avodah von an Evet Pashut, which represents serving Hashem as that simple servant, without questions, without expectations, without inspiration, just simply doing and recognizing there's a master and that's it. He's not looking for anything for himself. And he only wants to fulfill the expectations and the aspirations of his master. So therefore, the fact that his neshama would be elevated cannot be part of the goal. That's part of the preparation. The goal is, what does the Eibishter want? That's what Rashi teaches us.